51 senators just made a choice. And that choice wasn't about protecting national security or safeguarding investigations. It was about protecting names. Powerful names. Names that appear in documents most Americans will never get to see. Because on a September afternoon in 2025, the United States Senate had the chance to release every file connected to the Epstein case, and they voted to keep them locked away. The margin was razor thin. Just 2 votes separated transparency from secrecy. But those 2 votes might as well have been a chasm, because on one side stood justice for survivors, and on the other stood protection for the powerful. What happened that day wasn't just another political maneuver. It was a message sent to every victim who's been waiting years for accountability. Your story still doesn't matter as much as their reputations.
I don't know if a woman was sold to Donald Trump for $22,500. I don't know what it means to call a woman fully depreciated. I don't know if it was just kind of a brazen joke between a couple of very powerful men, but it's certainly not a funny joke. It certainly implies and suggests a camaraderie in the idea that young women are for sale. On July 15th, House Speaker Mike Johnson told CNN, "We should put everything out there and let the people decide it." Well, actions are more powerful than words. The words were, "We should put everything out there." The action was he adjourned the House of Representatives early for August recess to avoid voting on release of the files. Well, the House is back in session now. So I call on Speaker Mike Johnson to stand up for the principle carved above those pillars on the Supreme Court: equal justice under law. Hold a vote in the House of Representatives on release of the files. The leader of the Senate told Fox News, "I always am a believer in transparency. I think more is always better." Today we voted on transparency, and the vote from across the aisle was case closed, no transparency, no accountability. I certainly agree with the sentiment. It's time to put everything out there. The American people have been clear. They want these files released because they still treasure the idea that possibly powerful people in this chamber actually believe in the principles that we were raised on here in the United States of America of equal justice under law, that nobody is above the law. Still cherish that little seed of hope that maybe when we have a vote in this chamber, 100 senators will say, hell yes. But today, they were crushed because the majority said, hell no. Seal the file, protect the president, protect the powerful. To hell with justice for the victims, the young women who were so impacted, devastated by the activities of Jeffrey Epstein and his associates. The American people know better. They demand transparency. They demand accountability. They demand justice. The victims demand transparency. The victims demand accountability. And the victims demand justice. And we had a chance to deliver today, and we failed them. My bill, which was introduced as the amendment by Senator Schumer, requires the Attorney General to release all materials and records related to Jeffrey Epstein and Ghislaine Maxwell, including the flight and travel records, the names of individuals, the names of businesses and nonprofits and other organizations, any immunity deals, any non-prosecution agreements, any plea bargains, any settlements, internal Department of Justice communications about decisions to charge or not charge those involved, all communications about attempts to conceal information or documents, and any documentation related to Mr. Epstein's detention or death. It makes one exception, and that exception is deleting the names of the victims involved. They should only be named if they choose to come forward. Let me quote from what this bill requires. No record should be withheld, delayed, or redacted on the basis of any of the following: embarrassment, reputational harm, political sensitivity, including any government official, public figure, or foreign dignitary. But it will redact names of the victims and underage witnesses, including their personally identifiable information, depictions of their abuse, or information that jeopardize an active federal investigation or national security. This was carefully crafted with the insights of law enforcement to hold people accountable and redact only what was necessary to protect either an ongoing investigation or to protect the victims. We had a chance to do the right thing today, and 49 senators said do the right thing, and 51 said no and tabled this bill. I hope my colleagues who voted to table the bill today will search their hearts and come back and say, bring it up again, because I want to be on the right side. I want to be on the right side of the principle. I want to be on the right side of the victims. I want to deliver on that little seed of hope that somehow, when push comes to shove, some powerful men in this chamber will hold other powerful men accountable. On behalf of every citizen who shares that vision across our country, who believes in the words carved above the Supreme Court, I and others will continue to press for accountability, for transparency, for justice. May it be so that we reconsider and 100 senators team up together to say hell yes on those core principles we cherish as Americans. Thank you, Mr. President.
The scene on the Senate floor was tense. Chuck Schumer, the majority leader, had pulled a tactical move that caught everyone off guard. He attached an amendment to a massive defense bill, an amendment that would force the Department of Justice to release everything: flight logs showing who traveled where, bank records tracing payments and hush money, immunity deals that shielded certain individuals from prosecution, internal memos revealing why some names were buried while others were exposed, grand jury materials that could finally connect the dots between Epstein's network and the people who enabled it. The amendment wasn't Schumer's original work. It was based on a bill introduced months earlier by Senator Jeff Merkley of Oregon, a straightforward piece of legislation with one clear purpose: expose the truth, protect the victims, hold everyone else accountable. Merkley's bill had been sitting in committee, ignored and sidelined, so Schumer decided to force the issue. He brought it to the floor as an amendment during a vote on military funding, knowing that timing and pressure might push reluctant senators to act. For a moment, it looked like it might work. The chamber was buzzing. Reporters scrambled to confirm what was happening. Advocacy groups watching from the gallery held their breath. This was it, the moment when sunlight could finally break through decades of shadow. And then the votes started coming in. 49 senators said yes. They voted for transparency, for accountability, for the principle that no one should be above the law. But 51 said no. They voted to table the amendment, to bury it before it could ever take effect. Among those 51 were nearly every Republican in the chamber. Only 2 broke ranks: Josh Hawley of Missouri and Rand Paul of Kentucky, 2 senators who've built their brands on anti-establishment rhetoric, voted with the minority. The rest closed ranks. They chose silence. But this wasn't just about one vote. It was about what those files represent. Because the Epstein documents aren't tabloid gossip or conspiracy theories. They're official records held by the Department of Justice, materials gathered during years of federal investigation into one of the most disturbing criminal networks in modern history. These files contain names. Not just Epstein's name or his convicted associate's name, but the names of people who were part of the system that allowed the abuse to continue for so long. Business leaders who funded operations. Politicians who looked the other way. celebrities who partied on private islands and asked no questions. The flight logs alone could rewrite what the public thinks it knows. They show who boarded Epstein's private jet, where they went, and how often they made the trip. Financial records trace money moving through offshore accounts, payments that don't add up, transactions designed to stay hidden. And the immunity deals, those are perhaps the most damaging of all, because they reveal who was protected and why. When prosecutors cut deals with certain individuals, they made a calculated decision. They chose to shield some people in exchange for cooperation or political convenience. The public deserves to know who benefited from that choice. Merkley's amendment had one exception built in. It would redact the names of victims and underage witnesses. Their privacy would be protected, their identities kept safe. But everyone else, the powerful figures who enabled or participated in the network, they would be named. No more hiding behind lawyers and non-disclosure agreements. No more using wealth and influence to escape scrutiny. Just the truth, laid bare for everyone to see. And that's exactly why it failed. The person standing at the center of this controversy isn't a senator. It's the Attorney General, Pam Bondi. She's the one who controls access to these files. She's the one who decides what gets released and what stays buried. And her actions over the past year have told a story that's hard to ignore. Back in February, shortly after taking office, Bondi made a promise. She told the public that the so-called client list was sitting on her desk. She said transparency was coming. Survivors and advocacy groups felt a flicker of hope. Finally, someone in power was willing to do the right thing. But that hope didn't last long. In March, Bondi's Justice Department announced it was releasing Epstein-related documents. The media ran with the story. Headlines suggested a breakthrough. Except when people actually looked at what was released, it turned out to be materials that were already public. Court filings that had been unsealed years earlier. Nothing new, nothing revealing. Just a carefully orchestrated PR move designed to look like transparency without delivering any. Then came July. That's when Bondi's office issued a memo that changed everything. The memo stated clearly and definitively that no client list exists. Case closed. No further investigation. No additional releases. The message was unmistakable. Don't ask again. But that memo didn't match reality, because the Department of Justice absolutely holds records that could identify who was involved in Epstein's network. They might not be labeled client list in neat capital letters, but the information is there. Flight manifests, financial transfers, witness testimony, grand jury summaries. All of it points to names. And Bondi's department is sitting on every single page. By October, when she appeared before the Senate for a hearing, her tone had shifted even further. Senators pressed her on why cooperation had stopped, why Treasury access had been cut off, why Ron Wyden's Senate Finance Committee could no longer review suspicious activity reports tied to Epstein's finances. Bondi's answers were evasive. She leaned on vague references to ongoing matters and national security concerns. But when senators pushed back, pointing out that her own department had confirmed no active Epstein investigations were pending, she had no real response. Just deflection and stonewalling. This wasn't how it used to be. Under the previous administration, there was cooperation. Limited, sure, but it existed. The Treasury Department allowed Senate investigators to review certain financial records. The DOJ worked with congressional committees to provide context and clarity. It wasn't perfect, but it was something. When Bondi took over, all of that stopped. Requests for information were denied. Meetings were canceled. The doors that had been cracked open slammed shut. And the phrase, case closed, became the department's official position. For survivors, that phrase is a knife wound, because their cases aren't closed. Their trauma didn't end when Epstein was arrested, or when he died in a jail cell, or when his associate was convicted. They're still living with what happened to them. They're still waiting for the full truth to come out. They're still hoping that someone in power will finally say, "You matter more than protecting reputations." Senator Merkley understood that. When he rose to speak on the Senate floor, he didn't deliver a typical political speech. He made it personal. He pointed to the marble columns above the Supreme Court, where 4 words are carved in stone. Equal justice under law. Those words, he said, have become a hollow promise. Because if justice truly applied equally, then the Epstein files would already be public. There would be no debate, no procedural games, no political calculations, just transparency. He described sprinting up the Capitol steps to cast his vote, knowing how much was riding on that single moment. And when the tally came in, when he saw that 51 senators had chosen secrecy, he looked devastated. His voice cracked as he read the text of his own bill aloud, emphasizing the part that said, "No record should be withheld based on embarrassment, reputational harm, or political sensitivity." That was the standard he was asking the Senate to meet, and they refused. Merkley didn't just blame Republicans. He called out the entire chamber. He said that every senator had a responsibility to stand for justice, regardless of party. He pointed out that the victims don't care about partisan politics. They care about truth. And when powerful people in government choose to protect other powerful people instead of delivering that truth, it's a betrayal of everything the justice system is supposed to represent. He also warned that Pam Bondi's refusal to cooperate wasn't just a procedural issue. It was a moral failure. Because if the Department of Justice has information that could hold people accountable and chooses to keep it hidden, then it's not serving justice. It's serving power. The vote that day revealed something uncomfortable. It showed that despite all the rhetoric about accountability and transparency, there are still lines the system won't cross. There are still people it won't touch, and those people aren't protected by innocence or due process. They're protected by influence, by money, by the same networks that allowed Epstein to operate for decades without consequences. The files that remain sealed aren't just about one man's crimes. They're about a system that enabled, ignored, and in some cases participated in exploitation. And releasing those files would expose not just individuals, but the mechanisms that kept them safe. That's what makes this so dangerous for the powerful. It's not just about embarrassment. It's about unraveling a web that reaches far beyond Epstein himself. Think about what's in those documents. There are financial records showing who funded Epstein's operations, who received payments, and who benefited from his network. There are travel logs that prove who spent time in his orbit, not once or twice, but repeatedly over years. There are immunity agreements that reveal which prosecutors decided certain people were too important to charge. There are internal Justice Department communications discussing how to handle politically sensitive cases, which names to pursue and which to quietly drop. And there are witness statements, testimony from people who saw things, heard things, and tried to report things, only to be ignored or silenced. Every single one of those pieces of information matters, because together they tell a story that goes far beyond what the public currently knows. They show patterns, connections, a network built on silence and protected by power. When survivors hear that 51 senators voted to keep that information hidden, it's not an abstract political disappointment. It's personal. It's re-traumatizing. Because many of them have spent years fighting to be believed. They've faced public skepticism, online harassment, and legal battles designed to exhaust and silence them. They've watched as some of the people who harmed them continued living lives of wealth and influence, untouched by consequences. And now, after all that, they've watched the United States Senate say, "We're not going to help you. We're going to protect them instead." That's the message that vote sent. Not in words, but in action. Pam Bondi's role in all of this has become impossible to ignore. She's the gatekeeper. She controls what gets released and what stays buried. And her decisions over the past year have consistently favored secrecy over transparency. When she promised the client list was on her desk, people believed her. When she released old documents and called it progress, some gave her the benefit of the doubt. But by the time she testified before the Senate in October, the pattern was clear. She wasn't interested in transparency. She was interested in managing a narrative. Her defense has been that releasing the files could jeopardize ongoing investigations or harm national security. But when pressed, she hasn't been able to name a single active Epstein investigation that would be compromised. She hasn't provided evidence that national security is genuinely at risk. She's just repeated the same talking points, hoping they'll be enough to shut down the questions. They're not. The contrast between her February promises and her October stonewalling has been stark. And it's raised a troubling question. What changed? Why did someone who seemed committed to transparency suddenly become its biggest obstacle? Some have speculated that political pressure played a role, that powerful figures, both inside and outside government, made it clear they didn't want the files released. Others believe Bondi saw what was in those documents and realized the fallout would be too damaging, not just for individuals, but for institutions. Whatever the reason, the result is the same. The files stay hidden. The survivors stay waiting, and the people who enabled Epstein's network stay protected. But there's one name that keeps coming up in this conversation. One name that links directly to both the Epstein case and the current administration. That name is Donald Trump. And before anyone dismisses this as partisan attacks, the connections are documented. They're not rumors or speculation. They're facts. Trump and Epstein were friends for years. They attended parties together. They were photographed together at Mar-a-Lago, at New York social events, at private gatherings. Trump himself described Epstein as a terrific guy in a 2002 interview, noting that Epstein liked women on the younger side. Flight logs show Trump's name appearing on Epstein's private jet. Not frequently, but it's there. Court documents from a 2009 case include testimony mentioning Trump's presence at Epstein's properties. And then there's the letter. In 2024, a letter allegedly written by Trump to Epstein on official stationery surfaced. It was dated and signed, wishing Epstein a happy birthday. Forensic analysts examined the signature and confirmed it matched Trump's known writing patterns. The White House dismissed it as fabricated, but no credible evidence of forgery has been presented. None of this proves Trump was involved in Epstein's crimes. That's important to say clearly. But it does show that Trump was part of Epstein's social circle, that they had a relationship that lasted years, that Trump knew him, spent time with him, and spoke positively about him even after rumors about Epstein's behavior had started circulating. And now Trump's attorney general is the one blocking access to the full files. That connection matters. It doesn't mean the files are being hidden specifically to protect Trump. There are likely many names in those documents that both parties would rather keep secret. but it does create a conflict of interest that's hard to ignore. When the person in charge of deciding what gets released is appointed by someone who had ties to the subject of the investigation, it raises questions about whether justice can truly be impartial. Democrats have pointed to Trump's Epstein connections as evidence that the administration has a vested interest in keeping the files sealed. Republicans have fired back by noting that Bill Clinton's name appears in flight logs far more frequently than Trump's, and that Democratic megadonor Reid Hoffman has given millions to causes connected to Epstein's network. Both sides have ammunition. Both sides have skeletons, and that's exactly why the files need to be released. Because this isn't about scoring political points. It's about accountability. If Trump was involved in something inappropriate, the public deserves to know. If Clinton was, the same applies. If there are business leaders, media figures, or academic elites who enabled or participated in Epstein's network, their names should be public too. No one should get a pass. Not because of party affiliation, not because of wealth, not because of influence. Equal justice under law means everyone answers for their actions. That's the principle Merkley was fighting for, and that's the principle 51 senators voted to ignore. The aftermath of that vote has been telling. Advocacy groups erupted in frustration. Survivors who had been cautiously hopeful felt that hope shatter. Social media exploded with anger from people across the political spectrum, demanding to know why their elected representatives chose secrecy over transparency. Even some conservative commentators, who rarely align with Democratic priorities, called the vote a betrayal. Because this issue transcends typical partisan divides. It's not about tax policy or healthcare or foreign relations. It's about whether the powerful can continue protecting themselves at the expense of justice. And the answer the Senate gave was yes, they can. Merkley vowed to bring the bill back. He said he'd fight until every senator was forced to go on record again and again and again if necessary. He promised survivors that their voices wouldn't be silenced, even if the government tried to silence the truth. In the House of Representatives, a separate effort has been gaining momentum. A discharge petition, which would force a vote on releasing the files without needing leadership approval, has been circulating. It needs a majority of House members to sign on, and while it hasn't reached that threshold yet, support is growing. Some Republicans who voted to block the Senate amendment have faced backlash from their own constituents, people who thought they were electing representatives who believed in transparency and accountability. Town halls have turned heated, phone lines have been flooded with calls, and while political pressure doesn't always translate into changed votes, it's clear that this issue isn't going away. The public is paying attention. Survivors are speaking out, and the cover-up is becoming harder to maintain. Here's what makes this fight so critical. Every day those files stay sealed is another day the truth stays buried. It's another day survivors are told their stories don't matter enough. It's another day powerful people avoid consequences they might otherwise face. And it's another day the justice system proves that equal protection under the law is still just an aspiration, not a reality. The Department of Justice under Pam Bondi has made its position clear. Case closed. No client list. No further releases. But the files exist. The information is there. And the only reason it's not public is because people in power don't want it to be. That's not justice. That's not transparency. That's a cover-up. And calling it anything else is an insult to the survivors who've been waiting years for accountability. What can people do about it? First, they can demand their representatives explain their votes. If your senator voted to keep the files sealed, ask them why. Ask them what they're afraid the public will learn. Ask them if they believe equal justice under law applies to everyone, or just to people without connections. Second, support the advocacy groups pushing for transparency. Organizations that work with survivors need public backing and resources to keep fighting. Third, stay informed. Don't let this story disappear from the news cycle. Don't let politicians and media move on to the next controversy while this one remains unresolved. And fourth, share what you know. Talk about it. Post about it. Make sure people understand what's at stake. Because the cover-up only works if people stop paying attention. The fight over the Epstein files isn't just about one case or one network. It's about whether America's justice system can hold the powerful accountable or whether it will always bend to protect them. It's about whether transparency is a real value or just a talking point politicians use when it's convenient. And it's about whether survivors of exploitation and abuse will ever see the justice they were promised. 51 senators voted to keep the truth hidden. But that doesn't mean it has to stay hidden forever. Merkley is bringing the bill back. Advocacy groups are organizing. Public pressure is building. And eventually, the weight of secrecy becomes too heavy to carry. Eventually, the truth finds a way out. The question is how long it will take and how much damage will be done in the meantime. Because every day those files stay sealed is another day justice is denied. And the people who voted for secrecy know that. They're counting on the public losing interest, on the outrage fading, on the story becoming old news. But survivors aren't going to stop demanding accountability. And neither should anyone who believes that power shouldn't be allowed to protect itself at the expense of truth. This story isn't over. The vote that buried the files was just one chapter. The next chapter is being written right now by people who refuse to let the cover-up stand. by people who demand that equal justice under law means something real, by people who know that sunlight is still the best disinfectant, even when the powerful try to keep the curtains closed. So pay attention, stay vigilant, and demand answers. Because 51 senators might have voted for secrecy, but that doesn't mean the rest of us have to accept it.